No road left, little herbalist.
Then you'll have to come closer.
You will not touch her!
You could have died.
So could you.
3 weeks earlier, she was only a forest herbalist. He was a duke riding toward an ambush. Neither knew that one raised hand would change both their lives forever.
The pass was going to run red before noon.
Sapphira had known it since dawn, since she'd knelt in the ferns and found the crossbow bolts, oiled and waiting, and counted the shapes of men who did not want to be counted. She had traced the broken branches, the flattened moss, the careful stillness of a wood gone too quiet. 3 seasons she had walked this trail gathering root and bark, and never once had it held its breath like this. She thought of running for the village guard, and dismissed it in the same breath.
The captain drank through his watches.
The magistrate answered only to the coin, and whoever came thundering down that gorge road within the hour would be dead long before help arrived. So she did the only thing left to her. She stepped into the open path herself.
The ground shook first. Then the sound reached her, hooves like war drums, closing fast.
A black horse burst through the tree line, massive and lathered, its rider armoured in steel that caught the broken light like something out of legend. She threw her hand up, planted her feet and shouted for him to stop, not knowing, not yet, whose life she held in her open palm, or how far the echo of this single moment was about to travel.
The bolt in the grass had been fletched with black feathers.
And Sapphira knew black feathers meant men who did not want to be traced back to any house, any name, any lord. She crouched low over it, fingers brushing the oiled wood, and let her eyes travel up the slope where the ferns lay crushed in a line too straight to be deer. Bootprints. Fresh ones. 3 sets, maybe 4, pressed deep at the heel the way a man stands when he waits and waits some more.
She rose slowly, pulse a drumbeat in her throat, and that was when she heard it, the horse.
Not a farmer's mare, not a merchant's plodding gelding. This was the sound of something enormous and fast, hooves striking stone in a rhythm that shook loose pebbles from the gorge wall above her. Whoever rode toward that pass was riding straight into the waiting bolts, and they didn't know it, and there was no time left to shout a warning up the trail or send word ahead.
There was only time to move.
Sapphira gathered her skirts and ran for the open road, breath tearing at her chest, thinking only of the bend ahead, where the rider would round the rock face at full speed and never see the ambush until the first bolt found his throat. She broke from the trees just as the horse came thundering into view, vast, black, wild-eyed, its rider-clad head to boot in war-scarred steel that caught the sun like a blade unsheathed. She threw herself into his path and flung her hand up. The stallion screamed and reared, its front hooves cutting the air above her head, close enough that she felt the wind of it against her face. The rider hauled back on the reins with a strength that should have snapped a lesser man's arms from their sockets, and for one suspended heartbeat, horse and rider hung above her like a statue carved from fury and disbelief. Then the hooves came down, inches from her feet.
Are you mad?
His voice was iron wrapped in command, the voice of a man used to being obeyed before he finished speaking. Up close, his eyes were dark and furious beneath a helm dented from old battles, his jaw carved tight with the kind of tension that came from surviving things other men didn't. "Bolts are waiting for you around that bend," Sapphira said, not moving, not lowering her hand. Crossbows. At least 3 men were hidden in the rocks above the trail. If you ride another 100 paces, you will die there, and so will your horse. Something shifted behind his eyes, calculation replacing rage. He looked past her, toward the bend, toward the place where death was patiently waiting for him to arrive on schedule.
Who sent you to say this? Who sent you to say this?
No one sent me. I live in these woods. I know when they've been walked by men who don't belong to them. She finally let her hand fall, chest still heaving. Believe me or don't. But if you go that way, You won't live long enough to regret ignoring me. For a long moment he only studied her, the mud on her hem, the herb satchel at her hip, the utter lack of fear in a woman who had just thrown herself in front of a warhorse without blinking. Whatever he saw settled something in him because his hand eased from the hilt at his side.
Show me another way,
he said. Now.
She turned without another word and plunged back into the trees, and behind her the black stallion followed, snorting hot breath into the cold morning air, carrying a man she did not yet know was about to change the whole shape of her life. The deer track Sapphira chose wound low beneath the canopy, narrow enough that branches clawed at both their shoulders, and she moved through it with the ease of someone who had walked it 1,000 times in the dark. Behind her, the Duke's horse picked its way with far less grace, hooves sliding on wet roots, its rider's jaw tightening every time the animal stumbled. "This is not a road," he said low-clipped. "This is barely a rumour." "It's the road that keeps you breathing," Sapphira answered, not slowing. "If you'd rather take your chances with the crossbows, the bend is back that way." He said nothing to that, though she heard the faint huff of air through his nose that might have been the beginning of a laugh, buried quickly under old habit. They had gone perhaps a quarter mile when she raised a fist, and he stopped his horse instantly, without question, without the arrogance she'd expected from a man dressed in gold filigreed steel. She crouched at the tree line and studied the small clearing ahead, where two figures in dull leather leaned against a boulder, bows unstrung but close at hand. Scouts watching the main trail, waiting for a signal that never came because their prey had vanished into the undergrowth.
"Patrol," she whispered. "They're watching the gorge road, not this one. But if we're not careful..."
"I've evaded worse than 2 bored sentries," he murmured, and there was something almost amused beneath the iron in his voice now. They skirted the clearing wide, moving tree to tree, and Sapphira found herself once glancing back to find him watching not the scouts, but her, studying the way she read the forest like a page of familiar text, the quiet economy of her movements. It unsettled her more than the assassins had. By the time they broke from the trees onto the safer eastern road, the sun had climbed higher, and his shoulders had lowered by a fraction, tension bleeding into something more measured. He reined in his horse and looked at her properly for the first time since the ambush. Really looked, the way a man looks at someone he has decided is worth remembering.
"You have my thanks," he said, "though I suspect you'd have saved me the same whether I offered them or not."
"I would have," she agreed simply. "It didn't need to be you specifically. Just a life I could stop from ending badly." Something flickered across his face at that, not quite offence, not quite admiration, some third thing she didn't have a name for. He inclined his head, turned his horse toward the north road that led, though she did not yet know it, toward the towers of his own keep, and rode away without giving her his name. It was only later, walking home with her basket of roots forgotten and cold in her hand, that Sapphira realized she hadn't asked for it either. The gates of Ravenhold keep groaned open before Victor's horse had fully halted, guards starkling upright at the sight of their lord returning 3 days ahead of schedule, mud-streaked and grim-faced instead of triumphant. He swung down without waiting for a groom, boots striking stone with a violence that made the nearest stable boy flinch, and strode past the gathering crowd of household staff without a single word of greeting.
"Castellan Bramwell," he said, voice carrying flat across the courtyard. "My study, now."
Bramwell appeared moments later. Composure smoothed over something Victor recognized instantly as alarm poorly disguised, a man who had expected his lord dead in a gorge 3 days from now, not standing very much alive in his own hall, demanding answers.
"My lord, we did not expect."
Victor closed the study door behind them with a controlled quiet that was somehow more frightening than any shout. "Men were waiting for me in the mountain pass. Crossbows. Positioned with knowledge of my route and my timing, knowledge that only a handful of people in this keep possess." Bramwell's face did something complicated, a flicker of calculation quickly buried. "An outrage, my lord. I'll have the garrison ride out at once too. You'll have the garrison do nothing until I understand how the timing of my return became common knowledge to men hiding in the rocks. Victor moved to his desk, and there, exactly where he'd left instructions for no one to touch it, lay a ledger slightly askew from where he remembered leaving it. He opened it slowly and found entries in a hand not his own, payments to a merchant house he'd never authorized. Troop requisitions doubled against what the treasury records showed, gold moving in patterns that traced not toward his war effort but away from it, into pockets with names he recognized from his own council table. His jaw tightened. How long has this been happening?
My lord, I can explain the discrepancies.
You will explain them to my full council in the morning with every document you've falsified laid bare on that table. Victor's voice dropped lower, colder. And you will pray that what I find tomorrow convinces me this was carelessness and not treason. Because if it is treason, Bramwell, I promise you the mercy I show traitors is considerably less than I showed those men in the gorge. Bramwell's throat worked once before he managed a bow and retreated, and Victor stood alone in his study long after the door closed, staring at numbers that told a story far uglier than a simple ambush, a conspiracy reaching into his own walls, patient and rooted, waiting for the day he didn't have a sharp-eyed stranger on a forest road to save his life. He thought of her then, the fierce set of her jaw as she'd thrown herself into his path, utterly unafraid of a warhorse or the armoured stranger riding it. Whoever she was, she had no idea the size of the storm she'd just stepped into, or how much her warning had actually spared. 3 nights later, under a moon thin as a blade, Victor summoned his most trusted courier to the stables and pressed a sealed token into the man's palm along with instructions given twice, quietly, so there could be no mistaking the delivery. The woman who lives at the forest's edge past the old millstone, Victor said. Green cloak, herb satchel, auburn hair. You'll know her when you see her. Give her this, and only this, and say it comes with the Duke's gratitude for a debt that cannot be repaid in coin. The courier rode out before dawn broke fully over the ridgeline, and by the time the sun cleared the treetops, Sapphira stood in her cottage doorway, holding a small carved box that had clearly cost someone considerable coin to commission on short notice, containing within it a ring of plain silver, unadorned, accompanied by a note in a hand both elegant and clipped. Gratitude, it said, from a man whose life you saved without knowing whose life it was. She turned the ring over in her fingers for a long while before she understood what it meant, that the stern rider in battle-scarred steel had been no ordinary soldier at all. Word of the gift did not stay quiet for long. By the following market day, whispers moved faster through the village than the courier himself had ridden. Servants murmuring to merchants, merchants murmuring to the wives of lesser lords, until the tale reached ears that had no business hearing it at all, ears belonging to men who sat at Victor's own council table and had paid good coin to ensure he never rode home from that gorge alive. In a shadowed chamber 3 days' ride from Ravenhold, a nobleman with soft hands and a colder heart listened to his informant's report with growing unease. A forest woman, he repeated slowly. Warned him. Guided him around the ambush entirely.
So the whispers say, "My lord."
The nobleman's fingers tightened around his wine cup until his knuckles whitened. Then our first attempt has cost us nothing but the element of surprise, and given the Duke a loose thread that, if pulled, unravels everything we've built. Find out what she knows, and find out whether she can be removed quietly before the Duke thinks to ask her anything more dangerous than a simple thank you. Outside his window, riders were already being summoned, men paid in silver and silence, and far away in her quiet cottage at the wood's edge, Sapphira had no notion at all that the ring on her work table had just made her a target as surely as any soldier on a battlefield. It was nearly a fortnight before Victor rode out to the timberline himself, telling his household only that he required air and solitude, though both his castellan's replacement and his personal guard exchanged knowing looks he pretended not to notice. He found her exactly where instinct told him she would be, kneeling in a patch of wild sage at the forest's edge, sleeves pushed to her elbows, humming something low and tuneless under her breath. She rose when she heard his horse, wiping dirt from her hands, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The silence stretching taut between two people who had shared mortal danger without ever properly trading names. "You kept the ring," he said finally, nodding toward her hand. "I nearly sent it back," she admitted. A duke's gratitude felt like a debt I hadn't asked to be owed. "And yet you kept it." I decided a gift refused twice insults the giver more than accepting it once. A faint, reluctant smile touched her mouth. Besides, it seemed unwise to offend the man who commands half the province's soldiers. He almost laughed at that. Almost. "You didn't seem overly concerned with offending me when you threw yourself in front of my horse. That was different. That was your life. This is only pride." She studied him for a long moment, something calculating and curious in her gaze. "Why did you really come here, my lord? Surely a duke has more pressing matters than checking on a forest herbalist's use of his silver." His jaw tightened fractionally, some old wall shifting. "Because the men who set that ambush were not strangers to me. They were paid by people I trusted. And because you are the only person outside my own guard who knows the shape of what nearly happened in that gorge, which makes you either an asset to my safety or a liability to theirs. Which do you think I am?" "I haven't decided," he said, and there was something almost warm beneath the honesty of it. "Though I find myself hoping it's the former." The conversation that followed stretched long into the afternoon, shifting from careful wariness into something looser. Sapphira pressed him on why a man of his power still rode alone into danger instead of trusting his own guard, Victor countering that trust had become a currency he could no longer safely spend within his own walls. She spoke of duty to the wood that had raised her when her family could not, the freedom she'd carved from solitude and refused to trade for anyone's protection, however well-intentioned. He spoke, more haltingly, of the isolation that came with command, the particular loneliness of a man surrounded by people who wanted something from him at every hour of every day. "You say freedom is like armor," he observed, watching her hands move deftly among the sage. "As if isolation is the only shield strong enough to keep you whole. And you speak of duty like it's a cage you built yourself and now can't remember unlocking." She returned, sharper than she meant, though he didn't flinch from it. Neither of them noticed, in the heat of that exchange, the rider watching from the tree line a half-mile distant, tallying every visit, every hour spent, every piece of information that would matter greatly to a man with soft hands and cold intentions 3 days' ride away. By the time Victor rode back toward Ravenhold that evening, the sky bruising violet above the ridgeline, something had shifted between them that neither was yet willing to name. A thread pulled taut across the distance, separating a duke's fortress from a herbalist's cottage, fragile as spider silk and, though neither knew it yet, already marked for breaking by men who understood exactly how much that thread had come to matter. The smoke reached Sapphira's cottage before the flames did, a thin grey ribbon curling up from the herbal storehouse behind her home, and by the time she burst through her back door, the whole structure was already wreathed in orange, dried lavender, and rosemary crackling like kindling built for exactly this purpose. No, she grabbed the nearest bucket, but the fire had caught too fast, too deliberately, in 3 places at once instead of 1, and even as she threw water against the nearest wall, she understood with a cold, sinking certainty that this had not been an accident of sparks or carelessness. Someone had wanted this scene. I wanted it burning bright enough to reach the right eyes. By the time Victor's riders found her an hour later, soot-streaked and trembling with fury rather than fear, half her winter stores of medicine lay in ash, and a single torn scrap of cloth snagged on the storehouse fence bore a crest she didn't recognize, but that made the captain of the guard go very still and very pale. "House of Ashford," he murmured. "My lord will want to see this immediately." Victor arrived within the hour, and the look on his face when he saw the ruined storehouse was not the cold calculation Sapphira had come to expect from him in matters of court. It was something rower, something that looked disturbingly like fear finally catching up to a man who had spent his whole life outrunning it. "They did this to draw me out," he said quietly, crouching beside the blackened timbers. "To prove they could reach anyone I valued. This was never about herbs, Sapphira. This was a message. Then they've delivered it," she said, arms crossed tight over the tremor still working through her hands. "What message do you intend to send back?" His eyes met hers, dark and unyielding. "That anyone who touches what's mine answers to me directly." He rose, already turning to his captain. "Station 6 men around this cottage, in the trees unseen. I want eyes on every path leading here by nightfall. My lord, the household will notice guards missing from the keep." "Then let them notice," Victor said, voice flat as a blade's edge. "I would rather explain missing guards than explain a second grave." That night, hidden riders melted into the shadows around Sapphira's cottage, close enough to hear her breathing through the walls, far enough that she wouldn't feel caged by their presence. Though she noticed them anyway, of course she did. She noticed everything in these woods, and lying awake in the dark, she found herself grateful and unsettled in equal measure that a duke's protection now wrapped so completely around her quiet, solitary life. The great hall of Ravenhold had gone utterly silent by the time Victor finished speaking, every noble and knight seated at the long table holding their breath as he laid the torn scrap of Ashford cloth on the polished wood before them like a verdict already rendered. "Sir Aldrich Ashford," Victor said, and the knight in question went pale beneath his dark beard, hand twitching toward a sword he knew better than to draw in this room. "You will explain to this council why your house's colours were found at the site of an arson attack against a woman under my personal protection."
"My lord, I have no knowledge of—"
"Do not." Victor's voice cracked through the hall like a whip, quiet and absolutely lethal. "Do not insult me with a denial I can disprove within the hour. Your steward has already confirmed the men who carried out that fire were paid from your household's coffers under orders bearing your seal." Aldrich's composure shattered visibly, sweat breaking along his hairline. "It was never meant to harm her, my lord, only to frighten. You set fire to a woman's home in the dead of night and call it merely frightening." Victor stepped closer, and though he wore no armour in this hall, every man present understood he needed none. "You conspired against my safety on that gorge road months ago. You have conspired against an innocent woman's safety now. And you will answer for both." He turned to the assembled council, voice rising to fill every corner of the vaulted hall. "Sir Aldrich Ashford is stripped of his knighthood, his lands, and his seat at this table, effective at this moment. He will be escorted from these walls before nightfall, and any man who offers him shelter within my province will share his fate." Aldrich's sword clattered to the stone floor as guards seized his arms, his protests dissolving into desperate silence under the sheer, immovable weight of Victor's fury, and as they dragged him from the hall, Victor turned to the rest of his council with eyes that promised the same fate to anyone else harbouring similar ambitions. "Whoever else sits at this table and answers to Ashford's masters," he said softly, "know that I will find you. It is only a matter of time."
No one in that hall doubted him for a single moment.
A few days later, with autumn light slanting gold through the high canopy, Sapphira ventured deeper into the forest than she had in weeks, chasing rumour of a rare black root that bloomed only in the coldest, most shadowed hollows, and it was there, 3 miles from any guard's watchful eye, that the silence of the woods turned suddenly, terribly wrong. She felt it before she saw it, the birds gone quiet all at once, the air itself seeming to hold its breath, and when she straightened from her crouch, 3 men stepped from the trees around her, blades already drawn, faces hidden behind rough cloth masks that told her everything she needed to know about who had sent them.
"No warning cry this time," one of them said, almost pleasant, almost bored. "No duke to save you out here."
Sapphira didn't waste breath on words. She flung her satchel of gathered roots into the nearest man's face, buying herself the half second she needed to bolt deeper into the timberland, branches tearing at her cloak as she ran with her heart slamming against her ribs and the sound of pursuit crashing through the undergrowth behind her. They were faster than she expected, closing the distance with the terrible ease of men trained for exactly this kind of hunt, and when a hand closed around her arm, she twisted hard, driving her elbow back into a masked face with a crack that bought her another few precious seconds of freedom. The ground began to slope upward, the trees thinning, and Zephyra realized with rising dread that she was running toward the cliffs above the eastern gorge, toward open stone and empty air, toward a place with nowhere left to run.
Behind her, the mercenaries laughed, low and confident, certain now that the chase was nearly over.
Word reached Ravenhold within the hour, carried by one of the hidden guards who had watched the ambush unfold from too great distance to intervene alone and had ridden for help the moment the mercenaries gave chase. Victor was already in the saddle before the man finished his report, the great black stallion surging beneath him as though it too understood the cost of a single wasted moment. He rode harder than he had ever ridden in any campaign, harder than the desperate retreat that had once nearly cost him his own life, because this time the life at stake was one he had somehow, without ever quite deciding to, come to value above his own. The forest blurred past in streaks of green and gold, and when he finally broke through the tree line onto the cliffside, what he saw stopped his heart cold. Zephyra pressed against the stone edge, 3 blades levelled at her, no ground left behind her but a long fall into the gorge below. Duke Lennox, one of the mercenaries said, almost delighted by the coincidence. How fortunate. We were sent to remove one problem. It seems we'll be paid double for 2. Victor was already off his horse, sword drawn, every ounce of the soldier he had been on a dozen battlefields rising to the surface in an instant. You will not touch her. The first man lunged, and Victor met him with a brutal economy of motion that ended the fight almost before it began. Steel singing through the cold air, and when the second came at his flank, Zephyra threw a fistful of dirt into his eyes, buying Victor the half-second he needed to finish him too. The third, seeing his companions fallen, turned towards Zephyra instead, blade rising, and in that heartbeat she stepped between the man and the cliff edge, not away from danger but directly into it, forcing his aim wide as Victor's sword came down like judgment itself. Silence fell over the cliffside, broken only by their ragged breathing and the distant rush of the gorge below. You shouldn't have stepped toward him, Victor said, voice rough, hands shaking as he pulled her back from the edge. You could have died. So could you, she answered, still trembling but fierce even now. I wasn't about to let that be the last thing that happened here. He looked at her for a long moment, something breaking open behind his eyes, and then he pulled her against his chest, armor and all, holding her the way a man holds something he only just realized he could not survive losing. The conspirators, once traced through Ashford's confession and the mercenaries' paymasters, fell in rapid succession over the following weeks. Lords stripped of title, coin seized, a network built over years unravelled in the span of a single season, until the whispers that once plotted the Duke's death now spoke only of his justice. It was on a quiet evening at the forest's edge, the same patch of wild sage where they had first traded honest words, that Victor came to her one final time, dismounting slowly, his usual iron composure softened into something far more vulnerable.
I have spent my whole life believing duty and freedom were enemies, he said. That a man who commands a province cannot also belong to himself or to anyone else. You proved me wrong the moment you stepped into my path without knowing my name.
And I believed isolation was the only safety worth having, Zephyra answered softly. Until a stranger on a black horse taught me that some risks are worth every danger they carry. Victor knelt then, not as a duke before a subject, but as a man before the woman who had saved his life twice over and asked for nothing in return. Stand beside me, Zephyra. Not as a woman I protect from the shadows, but as my duchess, in full sight of every lord who once thought you beneath this house. Let them see exactly how wrong they were. Tears caught in her lashes as she reached for his offered hand, pulling him to his feet instead of waiting to be raised. "Then let them see," she said, "that the wall between us was never as solid as they believed."
The wind moved through the ancient trees as they stood together at the forest's edge, and somewhere, far off, the last of the traitors' whispers faded into nothing, leaving only the quiet, unshakable truth of two people who had found each other on a road built for death and chosen life instead.
If you had stood in Zephyrah's place that morning on the Gorge Road, would you have raised your hand for a stranger, knowing it might cost you everything? Tell us below what you would have risked, and who in your own life has ever turned out to be so much more than they first appeared. Then stay close, because the next stranger on the next forest road is already waiting for their story to be told.